and welcome. Good day to all participants and welcome to the online workshop on risk-informed governance, climate action and finance mechanisms for local resilience. This is our first week and we have two sessions today and on Thursday, 7 July. My name is Ana Cristina Torlund and I'm governance and public administration expert at UNPOG. The online workshop is organized by the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA, through its project office, the United Nations Project Office on Governance, UNPOG, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR CIFAL Jeju, Jeju International Training Center, GITC, and the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, Global Education and Training Institute, in collaboration with Incheon Metropolitan City and the Ministry of Interior and Safety of the Republic of Korea, and the Making Cities Resilient 2030 initiative. Let me start the opening session by introducing Mr. Hong Ki-Choi, Director of UNITAR CIFAL Jeju, GITC, Jeju of the Republic of Korea, who will deliver the welcome remarks. Mr. Choi, you have the floor.
Mr. Bo-Gyun Shim, Head of UNPOG, UNDESA, Mr. Sanjay Bhatia, Head of UNDRR, Onia Jetty, dear distinguished speakers and participants, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening for some of you. As the Director of UNITAR CIFAL Jeju, let me first warmly welcome all of you to our online capacity development workshop on risk-informed governance, climate action, and finance mechanisms for local resilience, co-organized by three entities, UNITAR CIFAL Jeju, UNPOG, UNDESA, and UNDRR Onea Getty. Our long-standing partnership has allowed us again to revisit the issue of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. I would like to thank UNPOG and UNDRR for putting the efforts together to organize this capacity development workshop. As a UNITAR affiliate training center, CIFAL Jeju has supported the mission of the UNITAR since its establishment 12 years ago, which is to develop capacities to enhance global decision-making and to support local and national level action for shaping a better future. While envisioning a world where knowledge-empowered people and organizations achieve results in line with the 2030 agenda, we provide the trainings and workshops aimed at building the capacity of local actors through exchange of experiences and dissemination of best practices. The overarching topic of this workshop is disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, under which all of you will be engaged in different thematic sessions to enhance the understanding of disaster risk reduction finance, global framework, and initiative for resilience progress, along with tools and resources on risk-informed governance for disaster risk reduction. This time, CIFAL Jeju will take the lead in the first thematic session on innovative finance mechanisms for local resilience to disasters by having two lectures on current disaster risk finance architecture and disaster risk finance in the context of public sector, private, and international development actors, in some cases in practices. In this regard, the two invited speakers, Mr. Joseph Inspur, Green Climate Fund, and Ms. Sumati Rajput, World Bank, will guide our participants to examine the innovative finance mechanisms for disaster risk reduction and resilience. We also invite Mr. Alex Mejia, Division Director of UNITAR, as a guest speaker. Mr. Mejia has led Global CIFAL Network and overseen the training activities of 23 CIFAL centers, including us. she will be in the perfect position to highlight the importance of an opportunity like this workshop, where we can further raise our awareness of why we need to develop capacity to make an actual difference on the ground. She will join with us for its presentation in the final session next Thursday. On this note, I would like to thank our participants and presenters for being here with us today. And I wish you all have a very fruitful discussion and a successful workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hong Ki Choi, for your inspirational address. And let me turn now to the introductory remarks by Mr. Buk-Hyun Shin, head of the United Nations Project Office on Governance, DPADG UNDESA, based in Incheon, Republic of Korea. Mr. Shin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. Good afternoon, evening, good morning. Mr. Hong-Ki Choi, Director, UNITAR CIPAL Jeju, Mr. Sanjaya Bhatia, Head of Office, UNDRR ONI and Getty. Distinguished guests and panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this important online workshop and to deliver my introductory remarks to commence this 4-day online workshop. Your participation underscores the significant role of risk-informed governance and innovative finance mechanism for climate action and building resilience, especially at the local level. Seizing this opportunity, I'd like to express my esteemed satisfaction for the continued partnership and engagement between our three institutions, UNPOG UNDESA, UNDRR ONI Getty led by Sanjaya, and the UNITAR CIPAL Jeju led by Hong-Ki Choi. This year's workshop is bringing together over 400 registered participants such as local government officials, including SDGs, Sendai Framework, climate, and urban development focal points. The pandemic has set back progress towards the SDGs and slowed implementation of the 2030 Agenda and other global frameworks. In addition, climate crisis is compounding threats across the globe. Extraordinary efforts will therefore be needed to make up the lost and accelerate progress. The engagement of local authorities is at the core of disaster risks reduction and building resilience, because local governments have been at the forefront of disaster response. Multiple risks require innovative approaches, timely action, and cooperation across sectors. Nevertheless, weak capacity to anticipate, plan for, and manage the multiplicity of risks and disasters can limit efforts to contain the short-term and long-term disruptions to development. Risk-informed governance helps to reduce risk, avoid and prepare for emerging risks, and building local resilience, because such initiatives will fail unless they are risk-informed. ICTs and digital technologies are increasingly being used by governments around the world for more context-specific solutions to local problems, to deliver essential services that are efficient, transparent, accountable, and inclusive, to leave no one behind. Having timely, high-quality data has become the foundation of resilient and effective governance throughout the pandemic. This workshop, therefore, provides a timely and unique platform to discuss and share knowledge on the concepts, tools, and approaches on how to localize and implement international frameworks into local or national context for greater resilience and sustainable development. It will also provide an opportunity for learning about how to leverage data and the digital government tools for DRR and resilience. Over the past years, member states have requested for more practical knowledge on digital governance, including strategies, technologies for risk-informed planning and decision-making for building resilience. In response to such requests, since July 2019, UNPOG, in cooperation with UNDRR, developed the training toolkit on risk-informed governance and innovative technologies for DRR and resilience. This toolkit will help address strategies and approaches on leveraging innovative technologies and building risk-informed governance. UNPO will continue to enhance efforts in strengthening its cooperation by building a solid partnership with UNDRR, Unitary CFR Jeju, and other related organizations to strengthen the capacities of national, local government officials and other stakeholders in implementing the 2030 agenda. I strongly hope and believe this workshop will provide a platform for in-depth discussions, knowledge sharing, good practices, peer-to-peer learning, and the lesson learned on innovative practices. UNPO looks forward to further engaging with you based on the feedback and the capacity development requests you may want to make for our follow-up actions. I wish you all a very engaging discussion and a successful workshop. Thank you for your kind attention. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Shim. And let me now turn to Mr. Sanjaya Bhatia, Head of Office of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction of Office ONIA and the Global Education and Training Institute. Sanjaya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Choi and Mr. Shim, for your welcome remarks. Let me take this opportunity to welcome all the participants. I see more are joining as we speak. So that's a good sign. This workshop comes at a very timely moment when we are seeing that the resilience gap between the rich and the poor, between big cities and small cities, between big developed countries and the third world countries is growing wider. And this is more emphasized by the lack of climate finance that we see, which is not available to many countries and to most cities to support adaptation to the changing climate, which is, as you know, we call it a climate emergency. And that's why this workshop is very timely, because it is going to focus on not only on finance but also on tools which can help local governments, so not only cities but other forms of local governments, develop, articulate their needs well, and start the process of developing bankable projects for finance. We all have seen the impact of COVID, how it has spread from the health sector to price of oil, to jobs, to the aviation sector, to the shipping industry. There is no sector which is not impacted. And what this means is that the systemic risk, that means the risk within the systems and the interconnectivity between the different sectors is stronger than ever before. And what that means is that we are not so good at risk reduction as we thought. Especially COVID-19 has exposed, you will see later, how many people have been pushed into poverty just by this one hazard. So as we move forward, we are also seeing that the world is becoming more and more urbanized. More and more people are moving to urban areas. The estimate is that by 2030, more than 60% of the global population will be living in cities and local governments. And what this means again is that the cities and local governments are going to be overwhelmed trying to provide services, including basic services like water, sewage, and disaster management. But they're also going to be overwhelmed by other factors such as poverty, unemployment, and of course, all the impacts of the hazards, especially the changing climate. So there are a lot of research studies which show that every dollar spent on risk reduction can save $6 on response and recovery. Now, if you think of it, it sounds very logical, very simple to understand. and yet it has become one of the biggest challenges to implement. We find so many gaps in policies. So we hope that in this the next 4 days sessions, you will be able to get the combined knowledge from UNPOG, from UNITAR, from, of course, from UNDRR, so from all of us, plus your own knowledge, because you are all practitioners. You are all working in local governments or living in local governments. You are associated with local governments. So you also have vast experience. So with all this knowledge in the system, we hope that you will be able to leave at the end with some good ideas on how you can influence decision making and the policies that are needed to reduce the risks and increase the resilience. So with this, again, I would like to thank all the partners who have made this possible. This is, as some of you might know, this is an annual program, and we look forward to more of such opportunities. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Sanjaya, for your introductory remarks. And let me close the opening session by thanking Mr. Choi, Mr. Shim, and Mr. Bhatia for opening the session. Now we will turn to our introductory session on the workshop and giving an overview of the workshop. And for that, I'll turn to the next moderator, Ms. Sang-hee Cho, Program Officer at UNITAR SIFA Jeju ITC, which is based in Jeju, Republic of Korea. Sang-hee, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna, for inviting me to the floor for the program orientation. I'd first like to say it's a great pleasure to meet everyone. I'm Sang-hee Cho, Program Officer of UNITAR SIFA Jeju, and I'll be your facilitator for most of the session today. Before I begin, I'd like to remind you again that you need to have your audio muted for better delivery of all content, and kindly ask you to turn your video on so that we can see each other virtually. And also, I'd like to ask each one of you to type your name and organization in the chat box during the program orientation. We will be checking in between to see that everyone's participating for the attendance. So your attendance is very important for the issue of the workshop certificate. So please make sure to type your name and your organization in the chat box. So now I'd like to go over our workshop overview briefly so everyone is on board. Let me begin with reminding you of the objectives of the workshop and what we want you to have at the end of the program. This capacity development workshop on disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation is organized on a yearly basis by UNITAR SIFA Jeju, UN Project Office on Governance, and UNDRR Global Education and Training Center. This year, the training is more focused on promoting risk-informed governance with technology for disaster risk reduction and resilience, taking stock of the innovative finance mechanisms for local resilience to disasters, and exploring the tools and initiative on making cities resilient to 2030. By focusing on these objectives, at the end of the workshop, we hope you will have understood the global framework for disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and innovative finance mechanism in the context of the SDGs. Also, you'll be able to strengthen capacities on governance innovation and leveraging risk-informed governance for DRR and resilience. Lastly, through a bit of experience in using the disaster resilience scorecard for cities to assess the city resilience progress for the development of an evidence and needs-based action plan. You can enhance your understanding on MCR 2030 and resilience roadmap. Now, I'd like to share some statistical information on the participants who have joined the program today. This stats is based on the number of the registered participants for the program. First, let's have a quick look at the country stats. This time we saw a total. Sorry. So this time we saw a total of 403 people from 29 countries register for the program. And as you can see in the pie chart, there are large portions in countries such as the Philippines, almost 1/3 of the participants, followed by Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and so on, which are quite vulnerable to disasters and climate risks. Next, when we look at the organization affiliation, you see the big portion of government sector, including international organization, which accounts for 41%, representing almost half of the participants, followed by academia, NGOs, and private sector. In terms of gender part, there are much more male participants with it taking up 73% than female participants. So, and now let's take a look at the program structure provided for this event. The workshop will be comprised of a diverse variety of sessions, including lectures, a Q&A, and quizzes. The quizzes will be a bit of fun and resourceful part of the session, where the participants will be given some time to remind what they have learned along the way and enhance the understanding on the workshop contents. So I'd like to encourage you to actively engage in all the sessions, get the gist of them, and to enjoy the quizzes for your sake. And as you can see in the table, there are 4 thematic sessions on separate days. Day 1 will explore innovative finance mechanisms for local resilience to disasters. Day 2 on risk-informed governance for disaster risk reduction and resilience. Day 3 on promoting climate action for achieving the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. And final day will be wrapped up with touching upon MCL 2030, accessing network of partners and useful tools to accelerate local strategies. Each of the thematic sessions will be led and coordinated by one partner organization with support from the others. Lastly, I'd like to conclude this orientation with some brief introduction of the organizing institutes. UNITAR stands for United Nations Institute for Training and Research. And CIFAL is an acronym in French, which means International Training Centers for Local Authorities and Leaders. CIFAL Jeju is one of the 23 UNITAR affiliated training centers located in the Asia Pacific region. And our main mission is to facilitate measurable knowledge and skills transfer for more effective sustainable development at the local level. The United Nations Project Office on Governance, as an integral part of the Division for Public Institutions and District Government, UNDESA, is mandated to assist member states in fostering effective, efficient, transparent, accountable, innovative, and citizen-centered public governance administration and services for sustainable development, and strengthen the capacities of public administration in Asia and the Pacific and Eastern Africa to translate the SDGs and other internationally agreed goals into institutional agreements, arrangements, strategies, and programs at country level. And our final organizing institute, the UNDLR Office for Northeast Asia and Global Education and Training Institute, was established in 2010 to develop a new cadre of professionals in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation to build disaster resilient societies. UNDLR Getty has a global mandate to provide capacity building support to mainstream disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation into sustainable development, convene and support intercity learning to strengthen resilience, and to provide capacity building and best practice sharing support to national training institutions working on resilience issues. So this is all from my end for now, and thank you all for listening. Now I'd like to give the floor again to Anna for a short poll. So Anna, over to you.
Thank you. So I will share with you a Mentimeter for you. If you can go to www.menti.com and then type the code 75048957 is also in the chat. In the chat box, my colleague just already add the code. We can see which is your sector you represent today in the room as we speak. Let me take this a little bit. So you have some time for you to go to www.menti.com and start seeing which sector you represent, so we know who is in the room. So the bars are moving. We have more and more participants who are selecting which, if everyone can join the www.menti.com and use the code 75048957, we can have more of the answers in the next slides. "30 more seconds for those who are still trying to get into menti.com. And we see the bars are getting very different from the beginning. Okay, so I think you can continue adding, and we will see the slide later. So we have basically most of participants from local government representation, national government. Then we have academia, but as well very good representation from intergovernmental organizations, nonprofit sector, university students, and other. So we will look at who are these other representatives after the Mentimeter. Thank you. So still many of local authorities in the workshop. So still everyone, if you can go to menti.com and type the code, and we can see the next slide. The next question: what is your knowledge on disaster risk reduction? So you can write if it's excellent or very good or fair or very poor or very, very poor. So we can have an idea, how is your knowledge on disaster risk reduction? "30 more seconds. We are doing this a little bit fast. So we can see we have some participants who have excellent knowledge on DRR, and most of participants have good knowledge for disaster risk reduction, which make our work more easy during the sessions. And those who have poor knowledge, we will make you learn a lot of DRR during those sessions. Thank you. Let's move on to the next one. At the end, I will show you the full responses. For the next question and last question for this part, I would like that you please rank the thematic areas that you are more interested. So we can look at how the audience is looking to the different topics we are presenting in this workshop. So financing DRR, governance, governance and digital technologies for DRR and resilience, and disaster resilience scorecard for cities and action plans. Thank you for, I think let's give a little bit more time. So the bars are moving, and we have a lot of interest on the two subjects, governance and digital technologies, disaster resilience scorecard, but also financing, which is moving more and more in the interest. So thank you. This is just to see how the audience are interested in the different topics, and we will have some other Mentimeters later in the sessions. Over to you, Sanhi.
Hey, thank you, Anna, for conducting the quick poll, where we can see the current stats on where they are from, pre-information level, and the thematic areas which the participants are interested. Before we welcome the two invited speakers for the lectures on finance mechanisms for local resilience to disasters, I'd like to invite Mr. Sanjaya Bhatia again to the floor for the overview presentation on the program contents, which will surely warm us up for the following lectures and sessions for the next 4 days, including today. Mr. Bhatia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sunhi. So what we thought would be good at this time is to bring everyone on the same page. So I'm just going to show you a few slides on kind of an introduction to DRR, and I've already shared these in the chat, so you can download from there. So the first thing that we want to talk about is to explain the concept of risk. And here you see there's a mountain, there's a landslide, there's a rock there, there's a landslide possibility. So that's the hazard. Then at the base of the mountain or the hill, we have some people living there. So they are that's the vulnerability. They are living there. They have a house which is probably more like a hut. Let's say they are below the poverty line, so their other factors are also increasing their risk. So there is hazard, there is they are exposed to that hazard, and there is vulnerability factors. But is that a disaster? So that is not a disaster by itself, and that's what we see around the world also. A lot of people are living with hazards, they are living exposed, they are vulnerable, but disasters are not happening. And we are lucky for that. So disaster happens when there is the interaction of the hazard, the exposure, the vulnerability, and that is what creates the risk. And how we deal with the risk, we can take many steps to increase the resilience. So here, what they have done is they've built a retaining wall. So that when there is a landslide, it will be the residential area will be protected and they will not suffer. Another way is to relocate, which is of course a very expensive option. So if we see in floodplains, some of the adaptation techniques are to raise the plinth level of the housing or the buildings so that it is above the flood level, and they don't get flooded with the seasonal floods. So there are many steps that we can take towards resilience. And as I said earlier, also $1 invested in resilience saves $6 in response. So, so this was just so that everyone understands these basic concepts, because we are going to build on this as we go further. And when you talk about, for example, in the next session about the financing of risk, all these concepts become important, because finance, but finance what? So basically what you want to finance are the steps or the mechanisms for mitigation and adaptation and prevention. So the other part that we wanted to bring everyone on the same page is that there is nothing like a natural disaster. There is no such thing. What we have is natural hazards. So for example, hazards. We are sitting in a room. All of you are somewhere in a room. You are looking at a computer. The hazard is fire. Fire risk is always there, right? The machine, the computer that you have, it might short circuit. There might be a fire. So, but what we do, we take steps to prevent the impact of that hazard. So what do? We put fire alarm, we put smoke alarm, we have water sprinklers, we have emergency exits, we have drills. So all of these steps are taken to reduce the impact of a disaster. So suppose we didn't take those steps, then what would happen? Then, and all these steps have evolved over years as people have got to study the disasters better and understand what went wrong and then try to fix it. So if we don't take steps, we will be exposed, our vulnerability will be there, and the disasters will impact us. So it is our choice. If we go and build something along the riverside, let's say a school, so we should expect that occasionally it will be flooded. And if we don't take measures to mitigate that flood risk, then we are waiting for a disaster to happen. And that's why it is the choices we make, it is the policies and the decisions that we take. And this whole workshop, all these days, is focused on equipping you with the arguments, the tools, the mechanisms by which you can influence the policies and the decisions. Another point is system of systems. So everything is interconnected. And I referred to this in my opening remarks also, that we saw in COVID, for example, something impacting health sector had a very bad impact on all the other sectors. Similarly, we can see that transportation, ecosystem, food, telecom, everything is interconnected. And what this means is that we cannot say, okay, we have made infrastructure resilient and we don't have to bother about community resilience or schools resilience or hospital resilience. No. If we leave any weak link, there will be a cascading impact, and that will lead to more problems in other sectors. So even right now we see there is a war going on in Ukraine. It is impacting food prices all over the world. It is impacting supply chains. It is impacting oil prices, prices of energy. It is impacting inflation. What it means is it's impacting the salary adversely. Just today there was a report, for example, in Japan, the rate of growth of salary is lower than the rate of inflation. So basically people are getting less money than they used to. So which means that they will have less paying capacity, they will have less spending capacity, which means that businesses will suffer. So it's a cycle. So everything is connected with each other, and we must remember this when we talk about resilience. Nothing is in isolation. Then even if we look at, and these are just numbers, I will leave them with you, but There are striking numbers. 1.3 million people died in disasters from 98 to 2017. That's a big number. And of course, apart from that, there is the economic damages of the disasters. This is also an interesting depiction of what the private sector thinks. So this is from the private sector perspective. And what they have plotted is the likelihood of impact, the likelihood of a disaster happening, and the impact it will have. So if you see the top right-hand corner, this is where the private sector feels that the likelihood is high, but also the impact is high. And if you see here, there's climate action, there's climate action failure, meaning climate change goes on unabated. There's extreme weather, there's biodiversity loss, which means the damage that we are doing to the ecosystems. There are disasters, there's human-made events, water crisis. All of these are different types of hazards that we look at. But if you look down, you also see social instability, national governance failure, state collapse, energy price shock, failure of urban planning. So these are all also factors which increase vulnerability to disasters, unemployment, fiscal crisis. All of these increase the vulnerabilities. So you see that even the private sector is thinking about this, and they are looking at these factors when they are planning an investment decision. So if they want to come to your city or to your country and invest, they're also looking at these factors. So, and we also know that as time is passing, there is increasing urbanization, unplanned urbanization, which is creating governance challenges. We are seeing, and I'll talk about it in the next slide, how poverty is actually increasing. We are seeing that disasters are becoming more frequent and more intense, especially the climate-related one. And we are seeing the risk drivers, all of these health factors, education, poverty, unemployment, all of these are getting interlinked. And this is creating the complexity of the risk drivers. Then, of course, we are still in the COVID emergency. It has not gone away. Unfortunately, some places around the world, we are now seeing, again, the numbers increasing. So, but more importantly, what the World Bank estimated that between 40 and 60 million moved into extreme poverty during the COVID crisis, and about 120 million moved into poverty. So poverty and extreme poverty. And this is the first time that this increase in poverty has happened in many, many decades. And all of these new poor, they are living in cities, in local governments, and they are working in the informal sector. So again, that is why it is important for both national and local governments, and especially the city governments, to support each other to deal with these impacts. So I think all of you know about the Sendai framework. That is an agreement from 2015 to 2030. And it looks at the roles of the national government, the local government, the NGOs, the civil society, the communities, everybody's role in trying to reduce disaster risk. So it's available in a number of languages. I would suggest to you, especially as I saw today, that there are lots of people from local government, national government, academia, and civil society and NGOs. So have a look at the Sendai framework and see what is the role that your organization has. Now, again, the Sendai framework does not stand alone. So this is the Sendai framework, but we also have the Agenda 2030, which is the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. We have the new urban agenda, which looks at the urban policies and how to deal with the different challenges of urbanization, including disaster risk, but many other challenges like informal settlements, urban planning, zonation, and so on. And then, of course, there is the Paris Agreement, which is looking at the climate risk. So all these agreements, all these frameworks, they all talk to each other. They all overlap. They cross-reference each other, and none of them can be achieved without the other. And if you want to think of a simple model, just think of the Agenda 2030, the SDGs, as the umbrella, and that is protecting us from the rain. And think of the Sendai framework and the Paris Agreement trying to prevent the wind from blowing away the umbrella. What it means is, without the Sendai framework and the Paris Agreement, we cannot achieve the SDGs. And then the new urban agenda will, of course, put them all together for local governments through urban policy. So coming to the end, we are more in the area which is red. So we are generally getting better at disaster management. We are good at getting better and better at response. We are way better than what we were even 10 years ago. But where we need to go is the blue area, where we are able to live with uncertainty, because the future is uncertain, and we have to learn to live with it. We have to learn to manage it through better risk prevention. And that can only be achieved through better policies, better governance, and better decision making. So I leave you with this cartoon. This person is asking the other one, when was our last 100-year flood? And they are saying it's last Tuesday. So basically, what we are saying is that the frequency and intensity of disasters is increasing. And we really need to step up if we want to manage these risks. So this is just a basic introduction so that we are all on the same page as we go forward to the next session on finance. And with this, I hand over to Sunhee. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjaya, for helping us gear up for the rest of the sessions. Now we have one more step to go before the first lecture. I'd like to suggest taking a group photo. So please make sure to have your video on for the photo. Please have your video on for the group photo. So since we are quite a large group, it wouldn't be done by one shot at all once. So please bear with me a few seconds more. So when I say 1, 2, 3, then when I say 3, please take a photo of all of us. So colleagues and the participants, all of you, ready? Okay, 1, 2, 3. One more time. Once again, everybody smile. 1, 2, 3. Okay, our final. Okay, this is our final photo. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you. Thank you all for your kind cooperation. So actually, we are kind of 10 minutes ahead of the time, but we will be starting our first lecture. Okay, so I'd like to give the floor to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Mr. Joseph Enspo. He is the Senior Climate Information and Early Warning Systems Specialist at the Green Climate Fund. He manages over a $1 billion portfolio of GCF adaptation projects. He has over 20 years of experience supporting developing countries to implement climate change and development projects in over 100 developing countries globally. His lecture will mostly focus on GCF investment strategy for climate-induced disaster finance. It'll be based on the GCF CIEWS sector guide, covering disaster risk reduction and the broader climate risk value chain. Let's explore together what it is about. You will have some time to ask questions after his 40-minute lecture. So if you have any questions, please hold your hand up or type your question in the chat box, and we will get to you during the Q&A time. Mr. Enspo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, distinguished invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Joseph Enspo. I'm the Senior Climate Information and Early Warning System Specialist at the Green Climate Fund. My presentation today will focus on climate risks, current disaster finance architecture, approaches and instruments for financing disaster risk reduction. By way of presentation, by way of outline, I will look at why we need to invest in DRR and climate information early warning systems. And then I will also look at, sorry, I'm having a problem with my, sorry about that. So by way of outline, I will look at the context why we should invest in DRR and climate information early warning systems. And then I'll look at the investment pathway. Pathway one will look at climate information services, modernization of hydromet services, regional hydromet programs. And then I'll look at pathway, the investment pathway two, which looks at impact-based multi-hazard early warning, early action, where I will delve into multi-hazard early warning systems. And then look at anticipatory action, forecast-based action, such as forecast-based finance. And then the investment pathway three, we'll look at how we use climate information and early warning systems for infrastructure design and resilience financing. And so I'll focus on climate resilient infrastructure across multiple sectors. We look at climate analytics for managing financial risks in private and public sector markets. Then we'll talk also a little bit about digital technologies and their role in climate investments. And then we'll look at catalyzing climate finance, the way GCF does its investment, look at some of the paradigm shifting pathways and drivers across linkages, the sectoral linkages, and now provide case studies. And so by way of content, we are seeing increasing impacts of climate variability and change. If you look at the past 5 decades, storms, floods, tropical cyclones, and droughts have caused over 3.7 million deaths and impacted 7.6 billion people. We look at the global economic losses during this period has also been very significant, talking about $2.4 trillion, which translate into 0.2% of the world GDP annually. And so if we look at islands, Africa, and least developed countries, they are those that are mostly impacted. And the cost is increasing over the years. If you look at between 2007 to 2016, we can see significant increase of disaster cost. And unfortunately, developing countries will not be able to do this alone without support from institutions like the Green Climate Fund. But more importantly, also, if you look at the NDCs, the NAPA and the NAPS, all the parties that had submitted the NAPS as of June 2019 mentioned the need for climate information and early warning systems. So early warning systems are also found in 50% of the NDCs that have been submitted. So the ambition is very clear. We need to identify action in terms of where the gaps are. And even in countries that are highly vulnerable to climate change, the level of ambition is far below what we anticipate, what is the evidence on the ground. So what we see is that the quality of information is very, very low and superficial. We will say that it is incomplete. But more importantly, also, if you look at the market assessment, we see the lowest capacity in sub-Saharan Africa. But then also we see a growing private sector that is creating some kind of traction in the sector. We see energy, aviation, large-scale agriculture, and infrastructure resilience as areas where disaster risk finance is needed most. And so why should we invest in climate information early warning system? We see, like I said, in the NDCs, 96% of countries in Africa, 83% in Asia, 82% in South America have requested for support. And 79% of all the natural hazards are due to hydrometeorological hazards. And WMO assessment in 2019 also provides a very grim picture of the readiness of countries to be able to withstand impending climate variability and change. It states that 49% of countries have fully established climate information user services, interface services. 52% of countries in Africa, 21% in Asia, 42% in South America, and 14% in Southwest Pacific, as well as 16% of the SIDS, and 49% of the LDCs don't have fit for purpose multi-hazard early warning systems. So if you will remember, the UN Secretary General has made a very clear call that we need to support all countries to be able to have fit for purpose early warning system to enable them to manage the impending impact of climate variability and change. But there are significant barriers that need to be addressed, particularly if you look at the scale of the capacity gap. And these gaps also create opportunity for impact, for investment impact to be made. The lack of enabling environment for institutional effectiveness, the lack of coverage and scale for effective service delivery in terms of the quantitative and qualitative enhancement of hard and soft infrastructure. We see also that governments have limited budgets for the hydromet services and disaster management agencies, and also the complexity of the disaster risk reduction intervention themselves, as well as market barriers, which creates blockage for private sector to participate in this very important action. But also more importantly, we see that uncoordinated interventions from different donors are limiting the effectiveness of existing support to developing countries. So to give you an example of the scale of the problem that we need to address, this is an example between disaster risk reduction, climate information, and early warning system. An example from tropical cycle. We will need to invest in hydromet services, climate information in terms of weather and climate extremes, which could be translated into hazards. And these hazards will enable us to predict the storm surge, flooding, inundated areas, and strong winds. And then we need to look at the impact of these hazards in terms of risk estimation. So we need to place these hazards in a situational context. And so we are looking at the disaster risk that is imposed, the hazard exposure and vulnerability of those vulnerable communities. And then we look at the risk reduction scenarios, which means mitigation and preventive preparedness, response, and recovery strategies that needs to be put in place to reduce the impact of disasters. So this is a really complicated task, and investment really needs to target where support is needed most. We need to find an integrated and comprehensive approach to addressing the challenges that we face with disaster risk reduction. But then if you look at the global financing architecture in terms of climate finance architecture, The slide shows the contributors. It also shows the bilateral institutions, those under the UNFCCC mechanisms, like the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and then the GEF, as well as the non-UNFCCC financial mechanisms. And then we also have the regional risk pool mechanism, like the Africa Risk Capacity, and then the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Finance Facility. So this gives a very clear picture of the architecture of climate finance in terms of how it is configured to address the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Sendai framework to some extent. And so to give you a little bit of the background of the Green Climate Fund, it was established in 2010 by 194 countries at COP16. It had its first board meeting in 2012, and in 2014, $10 billion pledges were mobilized. And then we approved the first projects in 2015. And by 2019, we had committed about 9.8 billion. We had mobilized 9.8 billion new pledges. And in 2022, we have 196 projects approved with 10.4 billion of GCF's money committed. So GCF is the biggest climate fund so far. It is an operating entity of the UNFCCC with the sole aim of fostering paradigm shift to low emission climate resilient development pathways in developing countries. And so the demand is growing. There's a growing demand for support in terms of GCF portfolio. We have, for disaster risk reduction, we have 21% of requests that is going into modernization of hydrometric services. And then 79% looking at sector applications, particularly agriculture, water resources, energy, and the other critical sectors of the GCF. And so what this clearly shows is that paradigm shift needs to be achieved in systematic investment in DRR through climate information L1 systems across the value chain. So incentivizing the use of climate information for investment and analytics is very, very important, while supporting long-term planning and preparedness, and also promoting low emission climate resilient development. So we see that without GCF support, the majority of countries will not be able to establish and operate fit for purpose DR infrastructure that the UN Secretary General has called for. And so in terms of investment, we look at paradigm shifting pathways. You will agree with me that the problems that we have indicate the level of effectiveness of the interventions that are happening in the past. It's very clear that the business as usual will not enable us to really meet the challenges that has been clearly articulated in the IPCC assessment report. So GCF, by way of looking at evidence and also being proactive, has come out with very clear pathways for investment that we think will enable the availability of robust climate information early warning system, as well as disaster risk reduction in all countries, making them widely available. So in terms of the paradigm shifting pathways, we think the first pathway for investment will be the origination of the risk information. Climate information services is very critical. And so the focus is on modernization of hydromet services, and then also establishing regional hydromet programs that will enable the scale, the economy of scale, and the programmatic approaches that will enable us to reach a wide range of the audiences that we service. And so establishing climate information and early warning systems or climate services will lead to the creation of relevant science-based information that is critical for decision-making, particularly informing investment pathway 2, which looks at impact-based multi-hazard early warning systems and early action. And the essence of this pathway 2 is look at short to medium-term risk. How do we better articulate ideas and investment to enable impact-based multi-hazard early warning systems and early action widely available? And then the third pathway that also builds on pathway 1 is how do we use climate information and early warning system for infrastructure design and resilience financing. And so we believe putting all these 3 investment pathways together will enable us to reach the desired transformation, which is investment for both adaptation and mitigation, as well as the broader resilience architecture, so that reliable climate information services and impact-based multi-hazard early warning system will support well-informed science-based decision-making to enable us to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement, the Sendai framework, and the Sustainable Development Goals. And so going deeper into the pathways, the pathway one, the essence or the focus of the pathway one is making robust climate services widely available. And this will consist of supporting the development of climate information service through the modernization of hydromet services. So we look at support for technical development. And by so doing, what we mean is optimizing what already exists on the ground and identifying the gaps so that we will fill them with additional investment. And then where we have best practices and lessons, we will scale up this knowledge in other areas that also need support. And we think that digital technologies are very important, particularly infrastructure, to transform the generation, management, and delivery of climate services. And we believe that climate services is basically IT services. Without the computational infrastructure, you cannot have very good, high-performing forecasting system. You cannot also be able to package and deliver the warning services to the last mile. So digital technologies are very, very critical in terms of delivering climate information and early warning services to the last mile. We also think that we have to support the operationalization of the global framework for climate services, which sets the standards for which climate hydromet services need to be established to make them more effective. And then we also think that we need to have a more transformational business delivery models, particularly looking at the public-private partnership, leveraging on other investment, including blended finance, which is critical to enable us to transform the hydromet services. The majority of the hydromet services rely on governments for support, and we know how difficult it is for governments to balance their budget and allocate support, enough support for the hydromet services. So we think a new business model is necessary that will enable bringing in the private sector together with the government sector architecture to provide a fit-for-purpose hydromet service. And also we need to drive uptake and investment. So we need to look at policy and governance and political instruments that will enable the uptake and investment of climate information and early warning system. And we think this will enable institutional effectiveness to happen when we have all this together. So enabling the creation of relevant science-based information for pathways 2 and 3 will be very, very critical by establishing a fit-for-purpose hydromet service. But then we see two components, sub-components, the modernization of hydromet services and also regional hydromet programs as the investment pathway that we would like to undertake. And then also we look at the second pathway, which making robust early warning, early action services widely available. And for this also, the target is looking at how to modernize the disaster management and related agencies, the community-based organizations, as well as partners to ensure that our investment results in savings of lives, securing lives and livelihoods, and also the sustainable development gains to be protected. And then we also want to make sure that climate-related risks are properly managed in a more efficient and effective manner. And the focus is more towards a short to medium-term risk by optimizing, establishing, and scaling up of mechanisms that will deliver people-centered, end-to-end impact-based multi-hazard early warning systems. But we think also this needs to be linked to other systems that are already operating on the ground. So we are looking at linking this to community development programs, governments and short responsive social protection mechanisms, as well as international preparedness and response. And then also bringing in the private sector, particularly supporting them in terms of business continuity programs that are critical to really keep systems in operation during, before, during, and also after disasters have struck. And more importantly, also, we are looking more into supporting forecast-based financing. As a matter of fact, every climate services project by default has this element of forecast-based financing as part of the design. And we think that also linking this to insurance will be very, very important by sequencing how these interventions take place. So two main subcomponents are envisaged: impact-based multi-hazard early warning system and anticipatory action, where we look at elements like forecast-based action, forecast-based financing as a default in terms of how we design our projects. And then finally, in terms of the investment pathways, we look at the investment that will enable us in terms of climate information, supporting systemic resilience frameworks, asset design structure and structuring, innovative financing solution, and improving availability of climate information early warning system data to help increase resilience against climate-induced disasters. We also think that building analytics, particularly looking at how we use IT technologies for climate resilient infrastructure, will be very, very critical in terms of day-to-day operations and management through the designing and planning for long-term climate change. And we think critically also in terms of the types of sectors that we have to impact, we have to make resilient. We're looking at the broader mitigation and adaptation space, but also we think that investment will constitute a paradigm shift for asset owners across all the sectors that we focus on, and also supporting the digital economy, weather derivatives, commodity markets, insurance, and protecting their investment against medium to long-term risk. And we focus on 5 private sector areas of practice where we want to mobilize, maximize mobilization of impacts. These are climate funds, financial institutions, project finance, climate markets, climate technology, and innovation. So how do we catalyze climate finance? In terms of GCF architecture, we see that delivering paradigm shifts for DR will require mobilization of finance at scale. And GCF's role is very, very clear. We are the most flexible fund in terms of the flexibility of our financing instruments and ability to take more risk than the traditional partners would do. We test, demonstrate, and unlock finance by taking risk. Where other investing institution will not do, GCF will go in and take that risk, that initial risk. So given the nature of the area and the type of client that we service, grant finance will often be important because mostly climate information early warning, disaster risk reduction, disaster risk impacts mostly the most vulnerable who haven't got the ways and means to be able to pay for services that will protect them. So we provide significantly grants for climate information early warning. It's mostly looked at as a public good, but then also we have other instruments like loans, co-finance, blended finance for the private sector where revenue is generated. And of course, digital technologies, climate analytics for managing investment and financial risk are very critical. So what are some of the financial barriers? Existing hydromet services, budget deficit and availability. Also, we see the political economy, the climate finance landscape, the market failures in terms of barriers to private sector investment. As a matter of fact, private sector, they think climate services, disaster risk reduction is not good investment. But then as the previous speakers spoke about, climate services, disaster risk reduction is actually good business. Every dollar of investment in early warning system provides between $3 to $36 or $40 in returns. So this is very, very significant. This is a strong business case that needs to be done. So information is very, very important, as well as positive externalities in terms of social return higher than the private return. So the impact, the social impact is more important than the profit. And so the challenges in terms of revenue streams and financial viability, and also bankability of projects becomes very, very important. And access to finance at local and for most vulnerable communities remains a significant barrier. So in terms of GCF financing instruments, we have grants, which we believe has a transformational potential to support planning, institutional capacity building, technical assistance, pipeline development, project identification and preparation. And we have some mechanisms that we deliver these grants, a readiness support program, project preparatory facility, technical assistance, and resource-based grants. For example, the multi-hazard early warning system we have established in the Philippines is based on grants. And then for loans, also we see the potential in concessional lending to match long-term nature of public investments. Finance with leverage co-finance and concessional private sector loans are some of the investment that we make. And so a typical example is the AFDB PDAC project, which is a transboundary project in the Niger Basin. And then also we have insurance, where we think the potential exists, particularly where GCF play a role in de-risking new insurance products, market development, including finance and technical assistance for new insurance services or emerging financial instruments. And we have also demonstrated this in the IFAD Sahel, one of the Great Green Wall programs that we are delivering in the Sahelian countries. And this is a very strong and a good project that will enable the deployment of both the continental insurance product from the Africa Risk Capacity, as well as microinsurance at the local community areas. And so in terms of our portfolio, we also have guarantees and equities. And we think that this will help the risk investment. GCF can use partial risk guarantees. We also have bonds that target specific areas of specific projects. And then we have public-private partnership also, where GCF leverage private investment for public delivery and play a role in technical assistance and other forms of investment. And so we think these are very, very important investment instruments that could help configure and help bring in private sector and mobilize finance at scale. But then let's look at some of the drivers of paradigm shifting pathways across those sectors and the specific linkages that we have. And so what do we look for? What would GCF consider as a good project for investment? First, we look for additionality of GCF funding. Why should GCF invest in such a project? As a climate fund, we will look at the strong climate rationale. We look at the climate impact of investment. We look at the scientific evidence of this being a climate problem. And then we also will look at the additionality that in terms of project must crowd in additional finance on top of what GCF provides. We also want this to be people-centered and country-driven. So we will look at alignment with the NDCs, aligned also with SDGs and the Sendai framework. We undertake early country engagement and also no objection letters from countries that they really endorse projects that have been brought to us. And then we also use 6 investment criteria to screen our projects by way of second level due diligence. We look at the impact potential, we look at paradigm shift potential, sustainable development potential. We will look at also the needs of the recipient, country ownership, and then also efficiency and effectiveness of those interventions. And then we have compliance with the GCF policies, so fiduciary standard, risk management policies. We also will look at environmental and social safeguards. We look at the MNE criteria, gender policy, and then the legal standards. And then we look at completeness of the documentation. But more importantly, also we have 8 resort areas that we invest in: energy, transport, building cities and industries, ecosystems, health, food and water security, livelihoods of people and communities, forest and land use, and then infrastructure. So all these encompasses all the areas where much of the investment should go into, and very, very comprehensive in terms of covering what are the most basic needs of the communities that we service. And so how do we look at the drivers of paradigm shift? We have identified 4 key drivers. We look at strategic planning and programming. We look at climate technology innovation. We look at mobilizing finance at scale. And then we look at coalitions and knowledge to scale up lessons and success. So for investment pathway 1, we will look at support for establishing the National Framework for Climate Services, mainstreaming climate services into policies. And then we also will look at the national and regional optimization of investment in hydromet. And for the climate innovation, we will look at establishment of the operationalization of the global framework for climate services at scale. We look at the new public-private partnership. We look at e-infrastructure, observing networks, and then the enabling environment. And for investment, we will look at how do we optimize GCF investment in financial instruments, looking at innovative financing, architecture, including blended finance. And then we also look at co-financing or blending with the systematic observation financing facility established by the WMO, and then the GEF and Adaptation Fund. And also at the national level, we'll look at how countries can ring fence some of the existing funds to support disaster risk reduction, and then also scaling up of government budgetary allocation for hydromet services. Also building coalition to scale up success is very important. So knowledge management is critical. Institutional collaboration is also important. And identification of best practices and lessons are also very important for paradigm shifting investments. And for pathway 2 also, we look at how we could integrate people-centered impact-based multi-hazard early warning into the planning, policy, and decision-making process at all levels. And looking at how we can enhance the mechanism for strengthening capacity at all stages in terms of the impact-based multi-hazard early warning value chain, look at community engagement and project pipeline development. And also in terms of innovation, we want to see whether we can make fit for purpose impact-based multi-hazard early warning systems widely available by strengthening capacity at the national level, and also enhance community-based multi-hazard early warning system and pilot some innovative ideas in terms of disaster communication systems, and then enhance mechanism for delivering and scaling up forecast-based actions. In terms of investment, we're also looking at the innovative financing solutions, scaling up forecast-based action through dedicated funds, insurance and market-based mechanisms, and also standard resource allocation, and as well as also integrating in some of the financing instruments and delivery mechanisms, and also coalition also to scale up impact-based multi-hazard early warning systems and early action. And so in terms of the paradigm shifting pathway 3, we look at the use of digital technologies as critical, use of climate analytics for managing financial risk in public and private sector is critical. We also look at promoting climate information early warning system-based information in climate risk management and decision-making. And also we think that promotion of digital technologies will be very important, blockchain, artificial intelligence, and the emerging technologies which we can leverage on them to transform the disaster risk reduction landscape. And scaling up investment, we also think that financing of climate analytics and digital technologies will be very important. Digital economy will be critical. Digital technology startups, we are looking at supporting innovative financing mechanisms for infrastructure resilience, and then supporting private sector and community investment in climate resilient infrastructure, and also extending existing financing arrangement to enable a system level and adaptation management and pathway approaches, and also build coalitions to scale up those successes and lessons. And so by way of case studies, I want to look at a couple of very good transformational projects that we have deployed globally. First, we would like to talk about Georgia, one of the early project that we did. This is a strong disaster risk reduction project. The GCF finances 27.1 million. The accredited entity is UNDP and the country is Georgia. So the critical pathway in terms of pathway 1 is expansion of hydromet observation network and provide reliable information that will lead to modernizing the hydromet service. We leverage significant co-financing and integrated hydromet infrastructure in terms of operations and maintenance costs as part of the government annual budgetary process to ensure sustainability of our investment. And the focus was on the most vulnerable people and communities. And then we also have the Philippines Land Bank project. This is one of the most important projects that we have, because Philippines is one of the countries that is most at risk. They have about 19 systems that develop every year within the basin. So Philippines is one of the places where we think the maximum impact could be made. And in terms of our investment, we invested both in pathway 1 and 2, look at state-of-the-art multi-hazard early warning system linked to forecast-based actions, forecast-based financing to maximize impact on the ground. So we're looking at adjusting to climate impacts and implementing long-term climate risk reduction and adaptation measures in the local communities. There was also high-level political buy-in to demonstrate the value of GCF. We also had to scale up best practices from the ground, the climate resilient development planning and investment, and forecast-based financing to reduce disaster risk. So particular focus was on saving lives, livelihoods, and assets across multiple resort areas, including most vulnerable people and communities, health, food security, infrastructure, built environment, ecosystems, and ecosystem services. And then we also have Liberia. Liberia is also one of the most important countries for us. They are still recovering from a war that happened about 20 years ago. They basically have no functional hydromet service and disaster management agency. So actually one of the priority countries that we have to support through the support also with UNDP. So our investment basically goes into safeguarding the building long-term climate resilience of coastal communities by investing in coastal protection, coastal management, and diversified climate resilient livelihoods. So this intervention actually also goes to build the coastal environment where most of the fishing communities are situated. If you've been to Liberia, you will see how dire the situation is. The fishermen cannot even land because of the impact of the sea, the storminess of the sea is eroding all the assets that they've made along the coast. So this is a very, very important project that really helps the communities. We deployed, we built a small fishing port for them, secured part of the communities against sea erosion, and then improved community knowledge on climate change impacts and adaptation practices, and strengthening climate sensitive livelihoods and supporting uptake of climate resilient livelihoods. So this is a very, very important project where GCF made $17.3 million of investment. And we believe strongly that this will not only save the lives of the people, but also will improve their livelihoods, most of them within these fishing communities. And then also we have a very important project, the Niger Basin project from AFDB. The Niger Basin is one of the most important river basins in Africa. It's in an area where climate variability and change is so complicated. Even the IPCC models have no consensus on how the future will look like. And these areas are impacted by a lot of climate variability and change, but also the impact of climate variability and change has led to resource conflicts, so that the transhumans, the Fulanis who have to migrate based on the water patterns, create a lot of conflicts as they encroach on farming communities, assets of farming communities. There's a lot of armed conflict that has resulted as a result of the droughts and the impact of climate variability in this region. So this is a highly political problem that is linked to climate change. And the important thing is that the board of the Niger Basin Authority is made up of the heads of state. And so solving this problem and reducing armed conflict through this intervention was very, very important. So GCF investment is $57.8 million. The total investment together with co-finance was over 200 million. And this was to improve the natural resource management, enhance the population's ability to adapt to climate change. And integrating climate information was very, very important in making this happen. And then we also have the UNEP Pacific project that we invested $47.4 million of GCF investment, and impacting on most vulnerable states, the Cook Island, Niue, Palau, Republic of Marshall Islands, and Tuvalu. And these states have existential threat from climate variability and change. The area is one of the least monitored in terms of climate. As a matter of fact, the oceans, which is critical for enabling us to be able to predict climate, is the least monitored. So most of our investment also goes into ocean observation network to support the global forecasting system, support to increase climate resilience of these 5 Pacific countries, will also lead to improving the global forecasting system. We're strengthening this through capacity building, improved policy frameworks, and also investment in climate and marine infrastructure and data management, which is very, very important for the community. and also community-based early warning and disaster risk management, including forecast-based financing, which is important for the communities, and establishment of regional knowledge and data hub to support disaster risk reduction in the region. And then we also have investment in Timor-Leste with GCF finance of $22.36 million. The unique thing about this investment, this project, is that it looks at rural communities, rural infrastructure. So our investment looks at two main areas: impact-based multi-hazard early warning system for climate resilient rural infrastructure planning and management. So we have investment in forecasting, risk modeling, communication, and response. We also looked at climate risk reduction and risk-proofing measures for strengthening resilience of small-scale rural infrastructure. So slope stabilization project, about 216 kilometer slope stabilization intervention. We also have 38 enhanced water supply system, including WASH. So we look at the sanitation element of our water investment, as well as the health in the country. And also we looked at 25 improved irrigation systems to support agriculture. And this covers about 54 kilometers of irrigation system deployed across the rural communities. We also looked at flood defenses, about 14.15 kilometers of defenses being strengthened. And more importantly, also ECHO-DR looking at the role of agroforestry and reforestation in managing disaster risk. So we have about 300 hectares of agroforestry and reforestation intervention. And then we also have a project in the Southwest Indian Ocean, looking at the Indian Ocean African states and Madagascar, a very, very important area. As a matter of fact, climate change is impacting this area to the extent that some of the systems that we normally would not expect in the Mozambican Channel is beginning to emerge as a result of global warming. So Hurricane Idai, which is one of the devastating impact that move beyond the boundaries that normally we'll expect a hurricane to impact, was realized in this region. So our investment in terms of the total investment, DCF investment of $52.8 million, goes to strengthen the capacity of these islands and Madagascar in terms of impacting, in terms of beneficiary, we have about 19.5 million direct beneficiaries, with 50% of them female. We also have a lot of interventions that will help in terms of managing the hurricane system, in terms of supporting communities with disaster risks, forecast-based financing, and the tools and methods that they need to secure lives and properties. And finally, in terms of the case study, also the Great Green Wall, this is IFAD Sahel, where we are using innovative integrated risk management approach to build resilience and adaptive capacity of smallholder farmers in rural communities in 7 Sahelian least developed countries. And this is a very, very important project that shows how risk financing is done. So we are looking at the project components of risk, climate risk preparedness, where we'll build the national capacity and system to generate, interpret, and deliver risk information, contingency planning, and further develop community early warning systems and agroclimatic services. And then we looked also at climate risk reduction measures through adaptation and mitigation, increasing resilience and low emission climate investment in the agricultural value chain, and income diversification. And then we look at the climate risk transfer, so micro and sovereign level mechanism to transfer residual risk to national and international insurance markets, and then develop country level risk financing strategies. So this is one of our most innovative projects where we are looking at risk transfer linked with risk preparedness and risk reduction in a way that we think will be very transformational in building resilience in the countries. So let me take this opportunity to thank you for your patience. This is the end of my presentation, and I will be happy to take any questions that you would like me to address. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Joseph Inspel, for your lecture. Once again, I'd like to ask you to have your audio muted for better delivery of all contents. So now we're going to have some time for questions and answers. So if anyone has questions, please raise your hand, hold up your hand, or maybe type your questions in the chat box, then we will get to you in order. During the lecture, I saw a couple of questions in the chat box. First was from, I guess, Mr. Ares Gutierrez, I guess. Yeah. Do you want me to read your question, or do you want to speak up for yourself, Mr. Ares?
Hi, good afternoon from Quezon City in the Philippines. I am just wondering if there are funding windows for community-based initiatives without passing through local government units. I mean, what I mean is that if community-based organizations can initiate programs and seek funding directly from the funders.
Okay. So should I respond, or you want to take a few questions before I respond?
Okay, maybe we can take more questions from the floor, then Mr. Nsufo will answer those questions all at once. So, and another question was about, it was from, I guess, Miss, maybe Purna Yahampath. It's about, the question is, have you made a country level feasibility on which finance mechanism suitable? If the answer is yes, please provide the country level details. That's the second question. And I just saw another question in the chat box. What are the best practices on adaptation in the Pacific? The question from Ladilin. Maybe Ladilin, Miss Ladilin, I guess maybe you can specify the question to the Mr. Nspo, I guess. Maybe more explanation might be needed, I guess.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Lady Lin. I was the one who asked the question. I asked that because being in the GCF organization, they have access to information from different countries, especially in the Pacific. I'm wondering if they have come across a good adaptation measure from which they funded from the Pacific. That's all.
Okay, so now I'd like to ask Joseph to answer these three questions, and then we will go over for the the following questions.
Okay, thank you very much. To answer the first question in terms of funding windows, we have a number of interesting funding windows. One is the readiness. We have also the NAPS, we have project preparatory facility, and then we have the traditional approach in terms of the regular funding window. But our investment criteria demands that we go through the country mechanism that represents the UNFCCC. So the way we are set up will not allow us to directly work with local government without going through their governments. But we need the no objection letter from the national designated authority, the focal point for the country. So every request to us will have to go through the National Designated Authority, which is one of the government ministries that the government has assigned. And so that would be my answer to the first question. But of course, I'm sure that if you want us to help you engage, we will be happy to do that. We have a very big civil society organization that are part of the GCF process, and part of some of the requests could be channeled or mobilized through them to us through the countries. Then we will be able to pick this up. Most often they raise some of the issues during our board meetings, and we, through the guidance of the board, will be able to determine the best way forward. But it has to be through a country-led process, through the government designated authority. The other question, the second question, I think, is more to do with country-level information, right? We do have country programming that the countries will submit to us as part of the process. The country programming helps us to build capacity of countries to be able to access finance from us. So we do quite, we do put in quite some investment to enable countries to develop their profiles, the climate profile, the risk profile, and other important information that will be needed to develop a country program, for a country to request for funding from us. So this information definitely will be available through our country programming division. And also we have the opportunity also to work with other partners like the WMO, who has a lot of knowledge or information on the weather information, the risk profiles of countries, and also through the hydromet services are able to provide information that can help in designing projects. And so we will say that we have some information, but not all, and we'll be able to assess countries to access additional information that they will need for developing projects. In terms of projects in the Pacific, I gave one example, the UNEP Pacific, which is a very good example of an adaptation and resilience project. This project supports the 5 countries to build resilience against climate change. The tropical cyclones or the typhoons are the main risk that some of these interventions will do. But of course, we look at a range of hazards. We look at heat, we look at all the critical elements identified by WMO to be of great risk, great hazards to the countries. We do invest in that in the multi-hazard early warning system project for the Pacific. We also have a project with SPREP, which also supports Vanuatu in building climate resilient communities, strengthening the hydromet service, and a couple of other projects in the Pacific. And I'll be happy to provide you more information if you need further support.
Okay, and thank you. And also, there are 3 or 4 questions in the chat box. The first, the user ID is 8888. So the question is, do GCF follow the climate change justices for climate change financing? If those who, the one who raised this question, if you want to specify this question, please have your audio on and please share with us. If you, oh, I guess.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yes. I'm from Nepal. I put a question about the climate justice. Do GCF have follow the approaches of climate justice to financing in the least developed and developing countries? Just now, these questions from my side. I'm Thakur Prasad from Nepal.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so do you want me to answer this or wait for additional questions? Hello, do you want me to answer this or wait for the next questions?
I'm sorry.
Do you want me to answer this or wait for
Yeah.
two questions? Okay, so yeah, the GCF is regulated by the convention. We have investment criteria and policies that shape the type of investment that we do and the way we conduct business. And we have zero tolerance for prohibited practices. So any form of injustice will not be tolerated by GCF. So we follow the international standards. We have environmental and social safeguards. We have laws or policies on money laundering, sexual exploitation and harassment. We have indigenous people policy, and all the policies that you will find in any credible international institution, financial institution, is followed strictly by GCF. And we have zero tolerance for prohibited practices. This is very, very clear in the policies that we follow in approving projects.
Okay, thank you. I see more questions coming in the chat box. So, and also we have a time, due to the time constraints, I think we cannot answer all the questions, but I will select some maybe questions that Joseph might answer for the program. So here's another question from Nabin. In the presentation, you mentioned about, I guess here it says MHEWS, but I guess it's a CIEWS. So CIEWS to strengthen, I'm sorry, about the MHEWS to strengthen CIEWS. Could you please state which multi-hazards are included in this MHEWS?
Okay, thank you very much. GCF is a climate fund. So every investment that we make needs to have a climate science basis. So basically, any hazard that has been identified by the IPCC or the WMO will fall under the type of hazards that we will invest. But of course, some of the systems and processes that will be established can also support other hazards. For instance, if you have earthquakes happening in an area where there is a tropical storm, there's already a GCF investment that builds the telecommunication infrastructure, that builds last mile delivery of support in terms of wash mechanisms, then it will eventually support a bigger multi-hazard early warning system in terms of other hazards that are not climate in nature. So we will basically build the core, the backbone, the core infrastructure that will allow any early warning system to function, particularly the communication infrastructure. Sometimes we will support also the energy systems, renewable energy deployments, and other elements of what will be needed for a climate disaster. But as a climate fund, we will basically invest in climate disasters.
And another question from, I guess, Harold. Is this also related with IOM UN migration? Last June 13th to 19th, 2022, for IOM UN migration and Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development, the shelter and settlement rollout, wherein there was a discussion for resilient housing. Can organization be tapped as one of the funding sources for temporary permanent housing affected by disasters such as typhoon and earthquake?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. If you remember one of my slides, earlier slides, I put on the screen the link between climate information, early warning, risk estimation, and the mitigation measures that are taken. Migration is a very important element of climate change. Actually, one of the responses that I had was that climate change is creating migration, climate migrants, we'll call them. And so anything that is induced by climate has a potential to receive funding from us. If a country makes a very strong case that migration or refugees have been as a result of climate change, definitely those investment will be, GCF will make investment to build resilient infrastructure and help manage climate migrants. And so it depends on the type of project and the type of request that is being made. And establishing the climate rationale is the basis from which those investments will be made. But definitely we have, like the example that I showed in the Niger Basin, we have transhumans, we have a lot of migration that have been caused by climate variability and change in terms of long droughts and other elements. So these are some of the investment that we will fund linked to migration.
Okay, thank you. I guess we have maybe 5 more minutes for the Q&A. So here's, I'd like to raise 2 maybe questions for you. One is from another Joseph participant. What are the common challenges in accessing the GCF for DLR and climate change projects? What are your interventions to capacitate proponents of potential projects? And the other question, what are the criteria to be selected for these climate financing programs country-wise? Are there any ongoing programs related to this in Sri Lanka?
Okay, thank you. I think I will start by addressing the problem of pipeline development challenges. The way GCF is designed is supposed to be country-driven. Country ownership is very, very important. And the clients that we deal, the non-Annex 1 countries, like I started in my presentation, have a lot of capacity challenges. So we have put in place a number of mechanisms and simplified approval process that will enable them to access funding to support their climate action. So we have project preparatory facility that helps countries and accredited entities to be able to put together a good project. We have also readiness support program that helps countries and accredited entities to be able to really articulate the climate problem and find climate solutions that we will be happy to fund. So if you look at my presentation, I spoke about paradigm shifting pathways, 3 key pathways. These are the pathways that we will fund. The investment will go to modernization of hydromet services, multi-hazard early warning, and early action projects, and then climate information for infrastructure and resilience financing. These are the 3 broad areas that we think has a paradigm shift and areas where GCF will support. So definitely we have quite a lot of support mechanism in place. For instance, in the case of Liberia, we're able to provide a lot of support, leveraging other partnerships that we have, bringing them together with the Liberian focal point and the African Development Bank to help them put together this project. At a record time, within 6 months, the project was ready. So we pulled together a number of resources that enabled this to happen. And I should also indicate that no country is greater than its universities. So you already have a lot of resources in the countries if you have universities and academic institutions in your country. So a lot of knowledge already exists in countries. How to manage, how to package them, how to align them to develop GCF projects is one of the challenges that we find. But we can help you to do that. We can help you identify who is who within the country and outside that can help you put together a transformational project for GCF. And we have a lot of funding that will enable this to happen. As a matter of fact, we have simplified our approval process by making available a pathway called a simplified approval process that will make 25 million available for you if you choose to go that way. It has a simplified and a less restrictive environmental requirements. It's quite simplified in terms of the type of documents that you need to provide. But we support you to establish the climate science basis and all the relevant elements that meet our investment criteria to enable you to put together a very good project for GCL. So yes, this is possible. If you need help and you contact us, we definitely will provide you the support that will enable you to get your project approved. In terms of criteria for financing programs, we have an investment criteria. I indicated the 6 main investment criteria that we look. The impact potential, that is for every dollar of investment, how much impact can we have on the ground? We have the paradigm shift potential. How can this crowd in additional finance beyond the life cycle of the project? So we want to look at sustainability of the project and how the program or the project will inform future programming. We have the sustainable development potential, which is to say, what are the environmental, social, and economical benefits? How does it meet the sustainable development goals? Then we have country ownership. Does it address the NDCs, the NAPs, and the country vision? And we also have needs of the recipient. Does it really address serious climate issues on the ground, like communities and requirements and needs? And then we have efficiency and effectiveness. How good is the project? How does it articulate in terms of viability of the project, both in terms of social, economic, and financial? But economic and financial are not the main reason for approving a project. It has to have the climate science basis, the needs of the recipient to be able to access the funds. That is why we give a lot of grants for climate information and early warning system, because we know that these are mainly public goods. There's no way we can ask people who live below $1 a day to contribute to funding a project for disaster risk reduction, early warning. So we provide a lot of grants, a significant amount of grants to support countries to be able to do that. So thank you very much for the questions, and I'll be happy to follow up after this program. You'll find my contact with the organizers, and we'll be happy to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph, for joining us and sharing your insights. As Joseph said, we have his contact information. So if there's any questions that cannot be answered due to the time constraint, we will deliver those questions to Joseph for further to gain further insights. So now we will having a maybe 10 minutes of short break. So 10 minutes of short break. So actually not 10 minutes, maybe 7 minutes, 6 or 7 minutes of short break. So please come back in time. Please come back by 4:05 Korean Standard Time. So see you in 6 or 7 minutes. Thank you all. See you soon again. So now we will be moving straight on to the second lecture. Our second speaker is Ms. Smati Rajput, a financial sector specialist in the crisis and disaster risk finance team in the World Bank Group. She has experience managing trust funds as well as working on World Bank projects in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Some project highlights include co-managing the global risk financing facility, supporting the Southeast Asia disaster risk insurance facility, as well as preparing and implementing disaster risk finance engagements across different South and Southeast Asia. Today, she will be lecturing us on the fundamentals of disaster risk finance in the context of public sector, private, and international development actors. We will again have some time to ask questions after her 40-minute lecture. So if you have any questions, please hold your hand up or type your question in the chat box. We'll get to you in order during the Q&A time. So Ms. Rajput, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sunhee, and it's a real privilege to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me and to be able to speak to so many people connected. Perhaps many of them already have a lot of experience working on risk finance, so I'd welcome through the session, notes in the chat or questions in the chat. But perhaps I just introduced quickly my colleague Sonal, who is also joined and will be supporting me on the presentation. So if you don't mind, I'll ask her to share the screen. Thank you, Sonal. So since Sunhee already introduced me, there's no need for me to introduce myself. We can go to the next slide, please. Excellent. So as Sunhee said, the objective of today's session is just to have a conversation about what is DRF, who should care about it, why one should care about it, and what have we learned from the experience over the last decade or so. And again, I want to start by saying that this experience, of course, is quite limited to me, right? But I think it's what comes from conversations that I've had with government partners, conversations that I've had with development partners, but it's in no way, the only kind of experience that exists. So of course, perhaps later on in the session, I'd welcome, thoughts from officials from, I see officials from the Philippines and others who have joined that might want to share their own experience as well. But to get us started, I think a nice way to frame this discussion would be if we have a short video. So Sonal, I'll let you play the video from the next slide to help frame the conversation on what we mean by DRF. There's no sound, Sonal.
This is our world. These are the schools that government funds helped build. These are the children that went to the schools that used up all the funds. These are more funds the government spent so more children could go to school, more desks could be bought, more villages could be helped. These are the storms that laughed at the funds, that washed out the schools that couldn't be rebuilt. This is the world without disaster risk financing. But with disaster risk financing, this is the world we can improve together today. These are the children whose lives we can help because we put aside funds for tomorrow. This is a world where planning ahead means moving ahead. A world with a better future, made better with disaster risk financing. This is the world we can build for her, for him, for them and them, for everyone, for everywhere, forever.
Smati, we cannot hear you.
Thank you. Thank you, Suni. So hopefully that provided a quick, nice, overview of what disaster risk finance is, and also hopefully it woke you up after the last session. So it was a nice teaser to start with. But really, I mean, when we think about disaster risk finance, the way that we categorizes is what it is and what it is not. So disaster risk finance, which is really financial planning for in natural events like disasters, but also applicable to other types of climate shocks or other types of shocks as well, is really about making sure that there's money available when it's needed. It goes to who needs it most after a disaster. The objective really is to invest in advance, to protect human and development investments, to protect capital investments, asset investments. It's really all about planning on how to meet the costs that governments incur after there's an emergency, but really anticipating those costs ahead of time. And one thing that's absolutely fundamental is that when we think about, when you think about a disaster, there's always a lot of chaos. There's a lot of delay when it comes to assistance reaching those that need these resources. So how can you streamline this process so that you can build in, first of all, predictability of long-term financing by understanding what financing is available, and also ensuring that money reaches those that need it most very quickly after there's a disaster. Now, what disaster risk finance is not, is that it's not the only solution to addressing the whole problem of climate and disaster risk management. It is definitely not the solution that's addressing long-term climate change and the trends that we're seeing in terms of mitigation. It's also not about fundraising after there's a disaster. It's all about planning in advance of a disaster. And it's not something that replaces or reduces the need for investments in risk reduction and investments in longer term development investments. It's definitely a core part of financial planning. It's definitely a core part of development planning, but it comes alongside all these other things that are absolutely fundamental for mitigating the impacts of future climate and disaster risks. Next slide, please. Now, we heard in the video, right? You saw a before and after, and maybe I'll just contextualize this in a few different ways. So typically when there's a disaster, a number of different things happen. When it comes to governments, when it comes to people, when it comes to businesses, there's often quite a few what we call negative coping strategies that can be adopted. This can be taking on lots of debt, at the government level, at the household level, it could imply taking children out of school. At the business level, it could be shutting businesses down. So there's a lot of negative coping strategies that emerge when it comes to not having planned in advance for disasters. The other thing that happens is that typically when there's a disaster, there's this small window where you could have something be you could have the financial impacts be magnified to a large extent because money isn't available. So every passing minute is quite detrimental to increase the social and economic costs, or you could actually be well prepared and avoid that from happening. So actually, often when money isn't available soon after disaster, that we miss that window of opportunity for it to become a manageable disaster, but it ultimately ends up becoming quite a devastating disaster and actually has a lot more impact on lives and livelihoods. And the third piece really is, which is absolutely core, is obviously government comes into action, but there's often a very detrimental impact on human capital investments, human capital programs, because what happens is you end up drawing away from what's normal, be it providing funding for regular kind of schools or funding for regular nutrition programs. Those all get diverted for disaster response. And so all these basic access service programs that are set up tend to actually not exist because of these disasters as money gets diverted to other programs. I list a few examples here below, but I'm not going to go through all of them because I think you'll have access to the slides and perhaps you can digest them further. But of course, they're all basically illustrating examples of the concepts that I just talked about now. Sonal, next slide, please. Now, if you were to plan for disasters, right, there's a few things, of course, that you can mitigate, which is you can preserve the future generations, from not being deprived of good schooling, not being deprived of the development programs that get stopped. There's obviously, I mean, the way to think about disaster risk finance is really to embed it within the government's day-to-day financial planning strategy. And this is what we see happening more and more around the globe. So I do want to talk very quickly about the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, which many of you may be familiar with, because it's really seen as a development initiative that's embedded within the region and that triggers very quickly every time there's a shock. So Caribbean countries know, exactly when payouts are going to be made, how much they're going to get, which really helps them protect kind of their ongoing development programs. Then government has money immediately after a disaster, which means it can channel assistance in that short window of opportunity to make sure that more and more people don't lose their lives and livelihoods. And finally, the most important part, which is that vulnerable households that often are most affected because of a shock actually have this assistance reach them quickly, as well as, allows them to smooth consumption and not adopt any kind of negative coping strategies at that level. There's a number of examples, for example, at the household level, where there have been pilots of index insurance, which means that funds can get triggered even before there's a shock. So they're based on specific triggers related to kind of when there's indications that the weather is going to, there's going to be bad weather and there's going to be a storm. So how can you trigger something even in advance of there actually being a storm? So really this allows for money to flow much faster and quicker than when, waiting for something to happen and then accessing those resources. So now next slide, please. So in a nutshell, hopefully it's quite clear, really the main message is disaster risk finance is really all about protecting livelihoods, all about protecting people, all about protecting development progress. And of course, most of these policies are driven by the government. And so the government plays a very fundamental role in making sure that that actually happens and is carried through in this manner. It's really about increasing the resilience of different levels within a country, be it at the national level, the subnational level, businesses, household farmers, as well as the people that are affected by natural disasters. And as we go through the next few slides, you'll see how different groups can be affected when they're not protected, and also how strategies can be put in place to avoid some of that from happening. Next slide, please. So why should you care? I see a lot of people in the audience, and I bet when we go through the next few slides, you can probably fit in some category or the other, because really something that's quite evident is that first of all, disasters affect everyone. And then the lack of financial planning for disasters also affects everyone, either directly or indirectly. And so it's really something that everybody I would say, has a role to play in, and also something that everybody could at least think about as they plan their own financial planning strategies, be it at the government level or even at different meso micro levels. So Sonal, next slide, please. So the way that typically we've positioned this area is really thinking about, how does lack of financial planning affect governments? How does it affect home and business owners? How does it affect farmers, herders? And this is primarily because we work in a lot of developing country contexts where they're a big stakeholder. And then how does it affect the poorest? Because every group, for example, has different, is impacted in similar yet different ways, and can actually put in place some kind of mechanisms to protect themselves. again, like I said, I think the government has a very strong role to play, and ministries of finance in particular, because they ultimately design and decide, the kind of financial planning strategies for countries. And so perhaps in the next slide, we'll talk quickly about the way in which government is affected, and how they can actually change kind of their approach through financial planning. So now next slide, please. So typically governments tend to be what we call emergency borrowers, right? And that's basically because often there's not adequate planning in advance, and the international community comes in. And when I say governments, I mean it tends to happen that developing country governments are so stretched within their existing budgets that they tend to have to seek international assistance in order to, in the times of crisis, to be able to respond to emergencies. But with financial planning, we're seeing more and more governments becoming what we call effective risk managers, because governments are now thinking about what they can do in advance of a disaster, what kinds of instruments can be placed in advance, so that when there's a shock, they're not reliant on the international or humanitarian community to come in and provide that assistance. Then if you plan, so often governments, when they're not as ready, they end up taking from their budget resources that are allocated to other activities. And this often disrupts, future spending on important initiatives. And being able to actually have dedicated resources available through financial planning can then protect and prevent such kind of diversion of resources. Typically after a disaster, governments also, invest a lot of time in negotiating with development partners, with humanitarian partners, on what kind of assistance is necessary. There's often assessments that need to be undertaken, a lot of dialogue on where money will flow, how it will be used. And this tends to happen after a disaster, which means every conversation is actually every minute wasted, and every minute wasted really is more and more lives lost and more livelihoods destroyed. So if you're able to actually do this in advance, then you determine kind of the rules of engagement in advance. You have the access to finance, but you also determine where the money goes, who it will be used for, and all of these negotiations happen in advance so that governments can really focus on the response itself, rather than in engaging with the many development partners or international partners that come in after a disaster to kind of provide this support. And finally, have a lot of in most environments, obviously, implementation of financial resources actually, or for response, actually happens either at the subnational level or through different line ministries. And when access to finance is not predictable, then it takes a lot of time for measures to be put in place so that the implementation can take place at that level. So actually having these agreements or arrangements with subnational governments, with line ministries, with households, to already determine, when funds will be triggered and have that communication, or how money will be spent, this can actually be hugely advantageous. And this is what, governments can actually make happen with better planning for disasters. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the other categories, be it the homeowners, the farmers, the poorest populations, so there's obviously, the most kind of obvious one is that when disasters occur, all kind of, be it businesses, they're affected because maybe they don't have access to credit anymore because the government is strained. When people are affected because maybe they can't, there's a flood and the bridge is washed away, so they can't cross over to go to their line of, to their place of work. And all of these kind of impediments then imply that there's often kind of a loss to their income, loss to their livelihood. And so what disaster risk finance can do is actually give them that quick access to resources, so that they can smooth their consumption, and they can basically continue to lead normal lives. Often when farmers, for example, don't have access to post-drought assistance, they're very hesitant to actually invest in innovative technology for crops, because they're worried that if they make these investments, then there's not going, and if there's the flood, then they're not going to be able to actually reap the benefits of those investments. So the idea is to make sure that, you know, with disaster risk financing, that some of these things can be avoided, so that you know, livelihoods are not lost, as well as you know, businesses as well as farmers are protected after a shock. Now, there's also this over-reliance of assistance from, you know, government to provide shock finance, and so there's ways in which, through, you know, there can be programs that can be put in place at different levels to increase the awareness of different groups, be it at the homeowner level, be it at the poorest of populations level, to basically embed the understanding of financial planning, and even have you know, have different groups undertake some of these activities that are, so there's a lot of micro insurance schemes that come into place through such dialogue, and this can actually you know, allow for some planning even at community levels, rather than always waiting for the response from the government. And finally, you know, obviously with disasters, there's an increasing expenditure increases on things like food, health, and human capital. And so if there's no rapid assistance to be able to mitigate these effects, then there's a lot of reliance on adopting longer term negative coping strategies, where, you know, farmers will take their children out of school, for example, or even small business owners will divert kind of resources in order to stay afloat. And so it's important that you know, the risk finance can play this role where that doesn't actually happen to these subgroups. Next slide, please. Now, something that, you know, is perhaps many of you are already familiar with this, because this is really the core of how we think about risk management or disaster risk management. Financial protection, as I said, is definitely not the silver bullet or the only answer to how to effectively manage risks. And it really fits within this broader framework of you know, risk management. So there's work that needs to be done to understand, identify risk. There's investments that need to be made in risk reduction activities. There's a lot that needs to be done when it comes to better preparedness. And of course, financial response, it is an equivalent resilient recovery, because there's a lot more resourcing that's needed after the initial kind of post-disaster support. You know, in the post-disaster support, you're doing a lot of the emergency humanitarian assistance-like activities, but there's a lot more that needs to be done for kind of longer-term reconstruction. And of course, there's ways in which you can plan for that, but it's just one piece of a much larger component. And risk finance is not something that replaces any of this, but certainly something that complements it. And something that a lot of countries tend to do through this process is really trying to link a lot of the operational preparedness activities to the finance. So what that means is that, you know, could you already in advance determine, you know, when there's a certain type of disaster in a certain type of area, what types of preparedness activities should be put in place, and what finance will be used to finance some of those activities. Also, what decision-making processes can be put in place so that, you know, the subnational government is prepared or the line ministries are prepared to respond. So the idea is to actually have finance linked to a lot of the preparedness and response activities, but in itself, of course, you know, you could just have a lot of money that sits somewhere without kind of the mechanisms built around it. And we'll talk about that also in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So we talked about this framework of risk management, but really, I mean, risk finance also sits within the intersection of a lot of different aspects that run, I would say, the economy, be it, you know, be it financial markets. I mean, if there's not enough planning, then there's no financial market stability. If there's no financial planning, governments can be in constant public debt. If there's no financial planning, there's no macro fiscal stability, which means the government isn't getting regular revenues. I mean, if people are losing their incomes, they're not able to pay their taxes, so there's not kind of adequate revenue. If you put in place social protection programs, but you don't protect those social protection programs, which means if there's not a way in which money can go through to the poorest populations in the case of a disaster, then all the investments made in social protection programs prior to that are not as useful anymore, because you actually push populations back into poverty. And so the objective of this little flower is really to show that it really cuts across all different dimensions that form an economy, and all different dimensions that lead to kind of sustainable, flourishing livelihoods of populations in countries. Next slide, please. Now, we talked a lot about this, but really there's 4 key things that I'd like to kind of highlight. When it comes to disastrous finance. One is really speed is the most important thing for when there's a disaster. Money needs to be available very quickly. And the small box here, this is what we plan for, which is the relief box. The others are things that you could have other instruments that pay out, or you could have future assistance that comes in, but really having access to quick resources, at least for the immediate phase, is absolutely fundamental. Then how money flows and where it goes is as important, because oftentimes there's examples where governments have very nice instruments in place. You have a large payout from a cat bond, then the money just sits there because the planning hasn't been done for how the money will actually move and who it will go to. So there's all these procurement challenges which exist. There's all these kind of financial management challenges that exist that need to be addressed while designing this mechanism for flow of funds. The third one really is around the disastrous layering. And here we haven't talked about this much, but we will subsequently, is that different types of instruments are useful in different types of contexts. So what that means is if you have a small flood, there's a specific way in which you want to pre-arrange finance for that small flood. But if there's a bigger flood, there's probably a different instrument that you want to use for that. So it's important that there's a holistic assessment of how government wants to respond to disasters. And then that helps determine what instrument is the right instrument for what objective. And the fourth piece really is around data and analytics. And this is actually fundamental, because in order to determine anything, you need sound data, and you need to be able to use that data to be able to make policy decisions. So even for things like what instrument is the right instrument, how do you design it, or where should money flow, you need to know where people live. So so data really underpins everything that the government plans for. So it's absolutely fundamental to have access to good data, to collect good data, and more importantly, be able to manage that in a kind of cohesive, comprehensive manner. Next slide, please. What can governments do? And again, this comes really from talking to governments, because I don't work for governments. So please take this only as experience rather than any kind of sermon. This is really based on working with countries. So what governments can do is that they can design and implement what is called a financial protection strategy. So in the next slide, Sonal, next slide, please, we'll explore what that means and how that can be done. So really the first step, as with designing any strategy, is to take stock of how do you currently finance your disaster shock? What do you have in place? How are you managing financial response after disasters? Is it primarily donor financed? Is it that you are actually have some kind of funds in place, you have some kind of instruments in place? So really undertaking kind of a diagnostic assessment of how are you planning for disasters or responding to disasters. The second one then is to gather the necessary information. I talked about the data, but really understanding what's the hazard profile, where is the risk concentrated, where do you see the most amount of disasters, how frequently do disasters happen? So really trying to understand the hazard profile of the country. The third thing then is to decide on policy priorities. And this is quite important because if you don't have priorities, then very quickly it seems like an insurmountable task. What that means is that it's very hard to protect everything, but you have to make a start somehow. So is the priority to protect the budget? Is the priority to protect agriculture, because that's the key driver of the economy? Is the priority to protect populations? And there's no one right answer. It could be you have multiple priorities. It could be that you start with a phased approach where you start with one segment and move on to the others. But the point is that if you don't prioritize, then it's very difficult to actually make any progress. So it's quite fundamental to prioritize. And then the third thing is really to build and implement this financial protection strategy, which is, like I said, understanding what's the risk appetite of the government to actually manage some of the risk themselves or transfer some of the risk outside to international markets. And so here, this is quite an important process, not only for kind of determining the risk appetite of the government, but really to bring others involved in the process, because lots of line ministries have a role to play, lots of agencies have a role to play, subnational governments have a role to play. So how do you actually bring people together and have them understand this kind of strategic planning approach? And finally, work with existing processes that exist. It's always tempting to start to create something absolutely new, but really the best way is to start with what exists and then build that out to meet your policy priorities. Next slide, please. Sonal, thank you. So the reason why I wanted to have a slide on this is because perhaps many of you have seen this before, but it's actually something that's quite a useful way to break down how to think about financial planning. So on one hand, you'll see that there's 3 concrete blocks, and you see on the left side, it says high frequency, low severity, low frequency, high severity. And what that means is that, there's usually all countries or governments, they know what are events that happen every year that are very frequent, that are maybe local floods that, they tend to happen in certain areas. There's a level of predictability in terms of the magnitude of these kinds of events. And so that actually is a big plus, because it means there's a way in which you could more easily plan for them. And there's some very kind of some different ways in which governments have done that. It's through kind of planning within budget resourcing activities. It's through having agreement in advance where money can come from, where it can be reallocated from, so that it's not taken away from important initiatives, and basically to develop some of these budgetary instruments. Then there's events that happen maybe once in 5-7 years, which are not every year, but they're still fairly predictable. So, every 5 or 7 years, there's going to be this level of a flood. So there's also ways in which that can be planned for. It doesn't make sense to plan for it annually, perhaps, but having access to contingent lines of finance so that there's kind of money available for these. It's not usually very large sums of money, but sums of money that can meet the kind of medium intensity events. And then there's the events that happen maybe once in 20, 30 years, which again, it doesn't make sense to plan for annually, and perhaps often it doesn't even make sense to plan for it on your own, but really to think about how can we purchase some kind of risk transfer mechanism so that you're paying like a small premium. And this goes to the catastrophe, the CRIF example, the catastrophe risk insurance facility example I talked about. But how can some of these market-based instruments like insurance be used where you pay a small premium but get a large payout when there's a big event? So there's different instruments that might make sense for different countries depending on the risk appetite and also depending on the types of hazards that are being addressed. Next slide, please. So really, you can develop the strategy, but as I said, what's as important is actually developing the system to ensure that when the strategy is implemented, the funds flow. So having in advance, for example, a coordinated plan for post-disaster action, how, what are the processes in terms of making sure the the money goes to who it's supposed to go, who's responsible for making what kinds of decisions, who needs to be consulted, how proposals should be assessed. Having all of that agreed in advance can be quite useful, because then it leads to what's called fast evidence-based decision making. You've already done the pre-work and you can make decisions very quickly. And then the last bucket is really the pre-planned systematic approach to making sure that money gets to where it needs to go. So I think that having this discussion linked to the financing strategy is absolutely critical, because you have an understanding of what resources will be available when, and then you can decide how decisions will be made to make sure that the money gets to who it needs to go to. Next slide, please. Now, we talked a lot about the government, and very quickly, maybe in the next 5 minutes, I'll try to talk about what the global community can do. And this involves many different actors that are in this space. The private sector, the development banks, humanitarian communities. I think we all work together as a global community. So it's applicable, I would say, across. But really what the international community can do is to work with countries to offer sustained financial and technical support. And I'll go through what that means in a second over the next slides, but really that's the crux of what I would suggest is a way. So first of all, really understanding what countries want. Oftentimes, development partners have priorities that they want to implement because perhaps that's what's, has fed from the bottom up, but really is some global priorities that are then trickling down. But it's important to really understand what countries want before going in and working on programs with countries. So what do they want to protect? Is it assets? Is it people? Is it budget? How do they want to do it? And this goes to the conversation on the risk finance strategy. Do they have a strategy in place that would allow them to decide which instruments they want to prioritize that coincide with their needs? And then what exactly do they need? Do they just need data? Do they need capacity building? Do they need finance? Or do they need it all? So really understanding what countries want is the first step. Next slide, please. Then providing this long-term sustained support. And what I mean by that is that this sounds, all the concepts and everything, it sounds easy. It sounds like it's what everybody knows and understands, but actually implementing it on the ground, it takes a lot of time. So it's not something that, okay, 3 months in and, we do something with the government and then we rush out because we do something else. It's a lot of long-term sustained support because it takes time. It takes time for governments to be able to make a lot of the changes that they want to make when it comes to budget allocation. There's regulatory processes involved. Developing instruments like insurance sounds great, but they're very risky. There needs to be a way to pay for the premiums annually. There's a lot of kind of technical work that's needed to design these instruments. So it's not something that can be done overnight. It takes a long time. And finally, really to actually have this be embedded within governments, to have institutions that are established for the longer term, it can take many years. So it's important that there's patience, willingness to work for a sustained period of time. Next slide, please. And then really, I like to make this point a lot, which is to coordinate to offer the best solutions. Because in the last decade, of course, there's a lot of actors, working in this space with governments, be it development institutions, the humanitarian community, private sector. And I think what ends up happening is often government spends a lot of time talking to all these different partners instead of actually spending time on doing things inside. But there's a lot of same types of conversation that are happening with different partners. There's a lot of different data that gets produced across different actors. And then this can often affect policymaking because ultimately we don't know which data to trust, which model to trust. Why is one model different from the other? So there tends to be a lot of different information. And then finally, often there's many different offers of financial support, and it's very difficult for governments to decide, what's the difference between one offer and the other. So I think there's need for some level of coordination in order to be able to not overwhelm countries with many options and many different decisions. So I think that's one thing the global community can probably work on. Next slide, please. And what have we learned? I mean, like I said at the beginning, there's many things that probably I tried actually to consolidate some generic lessons, because these can be applicable to any and everyone, but there's probably many more that have emerged. But I'll quickly go through the three that I've outlined. Sonal, next slide, please. So first, like I said, I think fundamental is really linking finance to preparedness systems. And the more that we think about this intentionally, the more that we see it work. So I wanted to highlight maybe through these a few examples of countries that as the World Bank we've worked in, and there's many others that other development partners have also worked in, which probably show similar results. But in Sierra Leone and Malawi, for example, we piloted engagements where we linked through projects. The government wanted to link actually finance with shock responsive safety nets. So it wasn't like developing just an adaptive safety net, but really linking money that's held aside specifically for the purpose of emergency cash transfers, so that when the shock responsive systems are built or created, there is actually, it's not like you're rediverting from an existing program, but you have money set aside to flow through those systems. And we've seen that in Sierra Leone and in Malawi, both these countries actually were able to mobilize these systems during the COVID-19 response. So actually Sierra Leone was able to mobilize an emergency cash transfer response in a matter of weeks because they did this work in advance, which is to actually link finance to the shock responsive systems. So there's huge merit in actually doing that with all types of instruments and making sure that there is intentional thinking about how the money will flow and what money is available. Next slide, please. Second is that financial and technical support actually go hand in hand. And what this means is that it's not just about providing really money to finance a risk transfer instrument or money to set up a contingent fund, but really thinking about the ecosystem that's needed to develop around that instrument so that it works well. And often this requires a lot of technical support. So we have, again, maybe I won't go through all the examples, but for example, in Mozambique, we're working with the government to actually design their first ever sovereign risk insurance scheme for cyclones. And here there's obviously the support that's needed for the premium subsidies for the risk transfer instrument itself, but there's also a lot of technical support that's going alongside to design the right risk model, to link it to the existing disaster risk management engagement, really making sure that the instrument fits within kind of the ecosystem and is designed well with good data and good resources. Next slide, please. Finally, something that, again, I alluded to in the beginning is that while we talk mostly about disasters specifically in this presentation, what we see is that more and more financial solutions or the principles of risk finance are really applicable to different sectors and to different contexts. So be it, so far we talked a lot about the budget, or we talked a lot about, populations, or the poorest populations or the farmers, but there's also kind of all these services, right? Like the infrastructure services that we get in terms of energy, transport, they're all disrupted when there's a disaster. So there's also financial planning principles that can be applied to those sectors to make sure that access to basic services is not cut off when there's a disaster. Then there's also a lot of, we see more and more countries interested in actually thinking about how to apply the principles of disaster risk finance to addressing their food insecurity needs, to addressing famine needs, to addressing conflicts in countries. And so there's this kind of emerging area of work, which is around applying the last 10, 15 years of experience in disaster risk finance to addressing other types of risks as well. And so, I mean, again, there's a few examples that are emerging, and I'm sure that we're actually excited to see how this develops and evolves, but there's already some work that's gone into seeing, exploring some of these, particularly in the light of the pandemic. Next slide, please. I think that might be my last slide, but yes. So I think with this, I will stop talking because I've been talking for a very long time. Sunhee, how would you propose to manage the Q&A? I'll welcome your advice.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Martin Rasput, for your lecture. So we will have some time for questions and answers. Already, I have found a couple of questions in the chat box. While I deliver these questions to Smati, if there's anyone who has more questions, please type your questions in the chat box. So here's one question from Dr. Shamin Anwar, I guess. How non-government organization take finance from World Bank before disaster happened? What will be the terms and conditions to get financed before disaster happened? So that's one question. And I'll deliver on the other question to you. This question is from Pruna Yahampath. Once I did the risk assessment for 11 districts at a divisional level, in capacity assessment, there were no any disaster financial systems found. So it's 0. In such a situation, how do we get a support from World Bank Group to ensure at least at divisional level risk financial systems?
Thank you so much, Sunhee. So I'll take both the questions one at a time. So the question from the non-government organizations, very interesting question. So of course, I want to answer it in two different ways. So NGOs form a key kind of core partner within kind of a country's systems, right? And if the government is accessing resources, be it from the World Bank or other development partners, this conversation of where the money should flow, NGOs should feature in that conversation. So what that means is, in many countries, for example, WFP is the frontline responder, right? So when government gets resources, then there should already be this pre-conversation on, whether what resources get channeled to NGOs, what resources get channeled to other areas. For the World Bank specifically, the bank's primary partner is government. So that's how development banks operate. So of course, in most countries where there are stable and functioning governments, the bank's kind of primary counterpart in post-disaster response specifically would be the government. But like I said, there could be conversations that NGOs have with government, and hopefully that will happen as part of a risk finance strategy where these funds can then eventually flow to NGOs. But as the World Bank, these conversations don't happen with the World Bank in the post-disaster scenario, if that makes sense. There are, of course, other types of engagement that the World Bank does with NGOs. There's recipient-executed grants that offer assistance directly to NGOs, but there's not usually post-disaster, but they're prepared for different types of development objectives, if that makes sense. On the second question, which is the risk assessment for 11 districts, I missed which country this question is coming from, but I mean, really the first step, if there is no assessment on DRF, there's no system in place, then really the first step is for government to think through how to develop their risk finance strategy. And typically what can easily be done is Ministry of Finance in that government can send a letter of request to the World Bank project team if there's interest in accessing support for designing the strategies, to actually write to the Ministry of Finance, writes to the bank representative that they engage with in country and seek kind of that technical support. And that's typically how we engage with countries, through our country management teams. So I'll stop here, Sunhee, but maybe there's other questions.
Yes, thank you. And there's another question from the floor from Sajid Khan. Population in conflict zones also face the climate risks. How to intervene them in order to establish safety nets?
It's a very good question, and it actually goes to the point of the compounding risk element of shocks. Typically, you can never see one. Typically, you can never see one shock in isolation of the other, but particularly in conflict environments, it gets exacerbated with risks like climate. I would say that there's obviously, I won't pretend to be an expert on this because I haven't worked in this area specifically, but there are examples. So in Somalia, in Syria, often the first step is to undertake, through technology like through drones and others, to undertake a risk assessment remotely to basically understand where are people living, what's the movement of population like, and this has been done in some of these countries, and then really working with the NGOs, because typically there's not functioning governments, so there's very strong NGO engagements. UN OCHA, I think, is very active. So there has been some work that I think OCHA and others have done on how to finance, the post-climate, post-disaster, in conflict kind of environment space. So that, it's working through the NGO community a lot, and then also doing what's possible, using technology to actually gather the information that exists, and making use of that.
And also I see a couple of questions more in the chat box. The question is, let me see. Can you give us an example of a local government in a developing country that has good practices in disaster risk financing? Actually, you already gave some examples in your presentation, but mostly it was based in, I guess, African countries. So maybe if you can give us some examples, maybe based on the Asia Pacific countries, I guess.
Sure. So both the Philippines and Indonesia have some level of DRF engagements at the subnational level. In Indonesia, for example, there are funds that there are some level of subnational government budget planning, but really the country has recently decided to establish what it's called the pooling fund for disasters at the national level, but with a very clear expectation to actually link that national budget planning instrument or national budget protection instrument to subnational governments. So then there would be a program that's intended to be developed where subnational governments can access resources when there's a disaster from this national mechanism, which is a DRF fund. And then there's also expectation over time to see how subnational governments could contribute to making sure that that fund remains sustainable. So that's one mechanism that's being developed. In the Philippines, there was, I'm not sure if there's colleagues on the call who are from the Philippines who may even correct me, but there has been previously a lot of interest for the country to develop a subnational risk pool. So that's basically, a risk pool is typically when you pool the risk of different countries or different subnational governments, and you offer kind of standardized but customizable products to meet their needs. So this often drives down the cost of premiums. It also diversifies the risk because perhaps there's not going to be a disaster. The same country may not experience, all countries may not experience a disaster at the same time. So the payouts would be phased depending on when there's a disaster. So in the Philippines, actually, there was a lot of interest in developing a subnational risk pool, but I'm sorry, I'm afraid I don't know if that actually has happened or not. And finally, on one example that's worth mentioning, which is not in Asia Pacific, but is Mexico. So Mexico actually has a very originally it was Fonden, and now it's evolved into kind of the government's own budget reallocation mechanism. But Fonden was very much structured as a way to engage or involve subnational governments. So they were involved in planning, budgeting, everything. So there was a very well-functioning program that exists in Mexico as well.
Okay, so I guess due to the time constraints, we cannot take further questions, but I'd like to deliver one final question to you, which is from Nepal. Information financing in DRR is found in local level, maybe indigenous community, cultural groups. What approaches World Bank has to mobilize the informal financing in DRR?
Very interesting question. And if I'm understanding informal financing, is it things like micro programs? Sorry, I should ask the question to the person. But I mean, there's a lot of work that has been done in countries like Bangladesh, countries like India, to work with communities, because the bank has a very large community-driven development engagement, where a lot of programs or a lot of projects are prepared directly with communities. So much of this would perhaps flow in that same way, in the sense, I can give you an example of Belize, where I worked personally, so more familiar, but there's kind of a municipal finance program at the community level, where there's 7 town councils selected, and the whole point was to actually work with the communities to design the investments and make sure that finance is available when it's needed. But there's probably a lot more examples of this nature, specifically in Bangladesh and India, through the community-driven development programs.
Okay, thank you, Smati, for your insightful presentation and also very resourceful insights on this issue. So do you have any last words for our participants before you leave?
It's a privilege to be here with all of you. So thank you very much for inviting me and for asking all these questions. I wish this could be more conversational so that I could hear your experiences and insights as well. But thank you very much for listening and for your questions. Sunhi, you're on mute.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you again for joining us and sharing your insights. So now I'd like to give the floor to a co-organizing partner, UNPOG, for the introduction of the day 2 session. So Anna?
Yes, thank you, Sunny. Thank you. Let me introduce you to session 2 on risk-informed governance for disaster risk reduction and resilience. Session 2 will cover the themes of risk-informed governance, digital government, and innovative frontier technologies to reduce disaster and climate risk. It will also share the principles of effective governance for sustainable development, and it will be an opportunity to share with you the training toolkit on risk-informed governance and innovative technology for disaster risk reduction and resilience, which is part of UNDESA curriculum on governance for SDGs. The link to the training toolkit is in the chat box, and I recommend you to review the toolkit before our next session. Let me now close today's session on behalf of UNDESA, UNPOG, UNITAR CIFAL Jeju, and UNDRR. We really thanks to our guest speaker, Mr. Joseph Insiful and Ms. Sumati Rajput, and to you all for your participation today. We hope you have enjoyed the training, and we look forward to seeing you on Thursday, 7 July at 2 p.m. Korea time. Thank you very much, and good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. See you the day after tomorrow.
Bye, Sanhi.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye.
bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye,
everyone.
Joseph. Thank you. Bye, Sir Ian.
Bye.
Thank you, Sasna.
Thank you for coming.
Bye, Fatima. Hi, Mama Lona. kape, kape, kape.